Welcome back to Guide to the Global Economy Special Summer Edition. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center. On today's episode, we are going to look at the EU elections with a particular focus on Belgium. But first, I want to turn to Alisha Chhangani, Program Assistant here at the GeoEconomics Center, to talk about our lead story, which is gold. Thanks. Alisha, what did we find out about gold this week?
Thanks, Josh. And gold, I would say, is our favorite topic at the GeoEconomics Center, so I'm very excited to talk about it. We decided to take a look into India, and India recently had its elections, and we wanted to take a closer look at what was happening. Some news came out that India actually moved 100 tons of its own gold from a bank in the UK and moved it back into the Reserve Bank of India, or the RBI.
Significant amount of gold.
So I was like, what is going on? What is going on with India? What's going on with gold? And this was happening during the election. So we decided to take a closer look what was going on with gold and central banks around the world.
Well, let's take a look at the data.
Yeah. So here we tried to look at the change in G20 central bank gold reserves over time, and we decided to look specifically post Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this was kind of important because we saw two major outliers, India and China, and we decided to compare that with the rest of the G20.
It's interesting because China's gold purchasing has got a lot of attention. We've written about it. Others have written stories about China's increasing its gold buying. Geopolitics plays a role here as we see post-Russia's invasion of Ukraine wanting to have something that's considered a safe asset that's not the dollar. But the India data, and India doing more than China, buying faster than China, that surprised me.
Yeah, so India's been consistently increasing its gold reserves from about 2017, but what we saw was a jump from around 600 tons of gold in its reserves to almost 830. So it was a big jump from 2021 to now.
And is it like China? Is it geopolitics what's driving the gold purchasing? What's happening there?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Governor Das, who's the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, kind of brought this up. He kind of alluded to it in talking about the conflict in Ukraine and really looking at dollar volatility and how gold is a safe asset, so it might be a good idea to turn to gold now.
It's interesting because from China's perspective, you understand geopolitical rival, they're looking for alternatives, but India is a U.S. strategic partner, so to see that kind of signal from India that they want to hedge away from the dollar feels different in some way.
Yeah, and also within the last 4 months of just 2024, India bought about 1.5 times more gold than it did in all of 2023.
That's a staggering statistic.
Which is what caught our eyes, and we want to look into that.
What about the rest of the G20 here? I mean, obviously much lower than India and China, but what's going on with every other country in the G20?
Yeah, so actually, the rest of the G20 did not move much since 2021. The little jumps you see here is actually led by Turkey. Turkey has been buying a lot of gold, selling a lot of its gold, and that's coming from its own inflation struggles that it's been going through.
So this kind of volatility in G20, even though it's minor, it's all Turkey-driven.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'd basically be looking at a flat line. And Turkey's gold buying is less geostrategic, more macroeconomic.
Exactly. I think we also wanted to compare just how much gold India has in terms of reserves. So we decided to pull another chart here for us, and we looked at the amount of reserves that India has in comparison to China and the rest of Asian G20 countries.
All right, let's take a look at that.
Yeah, so you can see that India has almost about double the amount of gold reserves than it has compared to China, and this is comparing all of the G20 Asian countries.
This actually really surprises me, maybe even more than the India surpassing China in terms of the pace of gold purchasing. It's doubling up China in terms of the percentage of reserves in gold.
Which is a super interesting stat, and I hope people can notice our gold, silver, bronze that we tried to include in our chart.
It's Olympic themed coming up here for our Summer Olympics that'll be in Paris next month. Okay, doubling up China, same with Japan. What do you think going forward? Is this a pace India's going to continue, or do they have what they need for the time being?
I think the pace is going to continue, but what I want to quickly talk about is that gold reserves actually don't make a big part of central bank reserves, right? We're talking about like 9 to 10%, and in total, gold is not as strong as the US dollar is, which makes up about 59% of global reserves.
This is a key point, Alisha. We have to put this into context, right? Like, it's easy to see this chart and say, wow, India's surpassing China. But in the macro perspective of how countries have their reserves, most are held in U.S. Treasuries. 59%, as we show through our dollar dominance monitor, of the world's reserves are U.S. Treasuries. That's come down slightly off the high from several decades ago, but still the overwhelming majority. Nonetheless, even if it's a small percentage of the reserve holdings, the interest in increasing gold feels somewhat significant.
Yeah. And I also want to point out that, India ranks number 9 in total of its gold reserves. The US, Germany, Italy still have significant amounts of gold. So when we're talking about these increases, they're significant, but in the grand scale of things, the US, Germany, and Italy lead in gold reserves and overall.
Yeah, right. We're talking about emerging markets here. I mean, not Japan, but emerging markets, South Korea. But if we look at US, Germany, Italy, G7 countries, there, gold reserves still very high, and that's an important perspective. Gold prices have been surging. You can understand why based on some of the data we've showed here. We'll continue to follow the gold story. It's important from an overall commodity perspective, but it's important for a geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective as well. And that's why, as you said, it's one of our favorite stories here at the GeoEconomics Center. Alisha, thanks so much for looking into it for us.
Thanks, Josh.
For Under the Radar this week, we wanted to look at the recent EU elections and take a particular focus on Belgium and their national elections. I want to bring in Clara Falkenek, young global professional here at the GeoEconomics Center. Clara, what did we find in Belgium?
So in Belgium, they had their federal and regional elections, as well as the EU elections in June. And it was pretty a surprising result compared to what was projected. We projected, and many polls did for many months, projected there to be a landslide win for the far-right separatist party Vlaams Belang in the Flanders region, because Belgium is an interesting case when looking at elections and how the country forms governments and rules itself, in that they have 3 regions, Flanders, Wallonia, and Brussels, and they all vote in their separate regions and then form a federal government, which is pretty small in terms of powers that they have. So in Flanders, the Vlaams Belang, so the separatist far-right party, was projected to win. However, they came up short, second to the New Flemish Alliance, also on the right, but not separatist at least. They want greater autonomy, but not separatist. And then in the Wallonia region, the reformist movement, also, like the New Flemish Alliance, center-right, won the election ahead of the socialists that have had a great impact before. So as a conclusion, I think that the far-right and the far-left extremes that we projected did not happen, but rather the center-right kind of prevailed and found some new ground, and perhaps these 2 parties can even work together to find a coalition government.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, the coalition government, because Belgium struggled in the past forming a government, almost more than any other country.
Well, Belgium is the world record holder in terms of both the time to form a government and the time to be without an elected government.
What is the world record?
So in 2010, 2011, it took Belgium 541 days to form a government after an election.
Almost 2 years.
And then again, in 2018, their government fell apart, and then it took them 592 days to form a new elected government after the elections.
So just thinking about that for a second, over a decade, or less than a decade, there were almost 4 years where Belgium couldn't form a government.
Yes. So we'll see. So one should be careful to make any terms of or any type of projections in saying that it will be a short, sweet, easy coalition formation this time. But perhaps it can be short of 500 days at least this time.
Well, let's hope so. Well, what if a government is formed? What are the issues they have to tackle?
So the major issue that Belgium faces is their government deficit and their enormous national debt, which is almost on par with US levels of debt.
So that's significant.
Yeah, and they are also coming or closing in on what the EU, they have set new rules after the COVID-19 pandemic. Fiscal rules have come back in action, and they are definitely risking some discipline actions from the EU.
So this is Brussels and Brussels, basically. The EU Brussels and the Belgium Brussels.
Yes, it's a fun dynamic. But these parties that I mentioned, so the reformist movement and the New Flemish Alliance, which had successes in this election, they have all or they have both seemed to be very inclined to cut spending and, take some action on reducing the deficit and the national debt. So.
Well, Clara, thanks for looking into it for us. This is a sort of classic under the radar story for us because there's this big thing happening, the EU elections, but then something smaller but also significant happening within Belgium. Appreciate you doing a deep dive into it. We'll continue to follow it here at the GeoEconomics Center.
Thank you.
Thanks again for watching Guide to the Global Economy. You can hit that subscribe button to see all our episodes. You can follow us on Twitter at ACGeoEcon. You can stay tuned to everything happening at the Atlantic Council GeoEconomics Center at our website. I'm Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the GeoEconomics Center. Thanks so much for tuning in.